In the year 1882, the sawmills along one single river in Michigan, the Saginaw, cut more than 1 billion feet of white pine in 12 months. One river, 1 year. A few years later, the city of Muskegon, on the other side of the state, cut 665 million feet of pine in a single season. Enough lumber, people said at the time, to build a board sidewalk more than 12,000 miles long, halfway around the world. By the year 1880, the state of Michigan was cutting as much lumber as the next 3 states in the country combined. And here is the part that I keep turning over in my head. Everyone, the lumbermen, the bankers, the newspapers, all of them, believed the pine was endless. Inexhaustible was the word they used. In about 20 years, it was gone. The entire north woods of Michigan was cut down by hand by men with axes in roughly the span of a single working lifetime. I have been reading the lumber camp records and the old Michigan timber histories, and I want to start with 2 real men, because they sat at the 2 ends of this enormous machine, and only one end of it ever gets remembered. The first man almost nobody knows, and he should be famous. His name was Silas Overpack. He was born in 1841, and he was a blacksmith and a wheelwright in the town of Manistee on the Lake Michigan shore. In 1875, a local farmer came to his shop and asked him to build a set of unusually tall wagon wheels. Then the farmer came back and asked for a set that was taller still. When Overpack asked him what on earth he was doing with wheels that big, the farmer told him he was using them to drag logs. And in that small exchange in a blacksmith shop, Silas Overpack saw something the entire lumber industry needed and did not yet have. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. The second man came at the forest from the other direction, not from a blacksmith shop, but from a counting house. His name was Charles Hackley. He was born in 1837 in Michigan City, Indiana, and he came to Muskegon in 1856 with almost nothing. He went to work in the lumber business, and he had a gift for it. With a partner named Thomas Hume, he built the Hackley and Hume Company into one of the largest lumber firms in the entire country, cutting some 30 million feet of pine a year at its height. By the time he was done, Charles Hackley had made a fortune of around $18 million out of Michigan white pine. So here are your 2 ends of the story. One man who invented the machine that moved the logs. One man who turned the logs into a fortune. And in between them, the thousands of men who actually went into the snow with axes and brought the forest down. The men the records mostly kept as a name on a wage line and nothing more. They had a name in Michigan. They were called the Shanty Boys. This is their story. To understand the scale of what these men did, you have to picture Michigan before they started. The lower peninsula of Michigan, and much of the upper peninsula too, was covered in one of the greatest forests of white pine on the face of the earth. White pine was the perfect lumber tree, tall, straight, light, strong, and easy to work. And it grew here in stands that ran unbroken for mile after mile after mile. To a country that was building cities and railroads and farms as fast as it could in the years after the Civil War, that Michigan pine was worth more than gold, because you cannot build a city out of gold. You build it out of boards. And Michigan had the boards, more of them than anyone could imagine using up. The trouble was getting the trees out of the deep woods and down to the mills. And the answer, at first, was exactly the same answer Maine and the Mississippi had found. The answer was water and winter. It is worth pausing on the trees themselves because we have nothing like them anymore. The white pine of Michigan grew straight and clean, often well over 100 feet tall, the giants approaching 200, with trunks 4 and 5 feet through, and the first branches 40 or 50 feet up. Many of them had been standing since before Europeans ever reached this continent. 2 and 3 centuries of slow growth in the cold. A single big tree could yield thousands of feet of clear, knot-free lumber, the finest building wood in the country, and they did not grow scattered. They grew in dense stands that ran for mile after mile, a green ocean of pine across the middle and the north of the state. When the lumbermen looked at that ocean, they did not see centuries of growth. They saw an inexhaustible bank account, and they set out to withdraw all of it as fast as human hands could work. The work ran on the seasons. In the late fall and winter, the Shanty Boys went deep into the pine and built their camps, rough log buildings, a bunkhouse where the men slept stacked in bunks, a cook's shack and a mess hall where they ate, and a blacksmith shop to keep the tools and the chains in repair. Then they cut. 2 men on a crosscut saw would drop a white pine that had been growing for 200 or 300 years in a matter of minutes, and other men would limb it and saw it into logs. The reason they did this brutal work in the dead of the Michigan winter was the same reason the Maine crews did: snow and ice. A loaded sled of logs that no team could pull across bare summer ground would slide almost easily over an iced road. So the camps built roads through the woods and watered them at night until they froze into glass, and the teams hauled the logs over that ice to the banks of the rivers. There, the logs were stacked and stamped with each company's mark and left to wait for spring. Life in those winter camps was its own hard world. A shanty boy rose in the dark, ate a heavy breakfast cooked by a camp cook who was guarded almost like a treasure, and went out into snow that could stand waist deep. He worked until dark, came back to a bunkhouse thick with the steam of drying wool and the smoke of a central stove, ate again, and slept stacked close with dozens of other men. Sunday was the one slower day, a time to mend clothes, sharpen tools, and swap the songs and tall tales that became the folklore of the North Woods. The men were cut off from the world for months at a stretch, paid by the month and held there by the work and the distance until the spring drive finally let them out. It was a young man's life and a dangerous one, and for most of them, it was simply the work that was available in a country made of trees, and the demand for that wood was almost bottomless. This was the age when America was building itself at a dead run, throwing up cities, laying tens of thousands of miles of railroad, and settling a treeless prairie that cried out for lumber, the very same prairie the Mississippi rafts were feeding from the west. When Chicago burned to the ground in 1871, it was largely Michigan pine that rebuilt it. Every boomtown on the plains, every new farm in Iowa and the Dakotas, every railroad car and fence and grain elevator needed boards, and Michigan had the boards. The pull of all that demand reached straight back into the Michigan woods and put an axe in every able man's hands. The forest was not cut down out of carelessness. It came down because a growing nation was hungry for it, and the men of Michigan were the ones who fed that hunger. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. When the spring thaw came, the rivers of Michigan became highways of moving timber. The Au Sable, the Muskegon, the Saginaw, and all its branches filled with logs, and the shanty boys turned into river drivers, riding the logs down the swollen water to the mills exactly the way the men did in Maine, with the same spiked boots, the same peavies, the same deadly work of breaking the jams. The Muskegon River carried the pine down to Muskegon Lake, where the mills were waiting, and the Saginaw carried it down to the mills of the Saginaw Valley. For a few weeks every spring, the rivers were so full of logs you could very nearly walk across them. It was dangerous, cold, exhausting work, and men were hurt and men drowned, and the names of most of them are gone the same way the names of the main drivers are gone. The River Drive was the heart of the Michigan system for a generation. But the River Drive had a weakness, and that weakness is where this story becomes a story about machines. The Michigan drives carried all the danger of the main drives and then some, because the volume was so enormous. The banks of the Au Sable and the Muskegon were piled high with logs all winter in great rollways, and when those rollways were broken loose into the spring flood, the river ran bank to bank with timber. Jams formed at every narrow bend and every shallow, and the same lethal work of riding out onto the face of a jam to free the key log fell to the Michigan drivers exactly as it had to the men in Maine. At the bottom of the Muskegon, the logs were caught in great booms on Muskegon Lake, where they were sorted by their stamped marks and fed to the ring of mills around the water. It was a system that could move a forest, and it did, but it was chained to the seasons, and that chain is what the lumbermen were desperate to break. The weakness was simple. If you can only move logs over ice in winter and water in spring, then you can only log the trees that grow close enough to a river to reach it, and you can only do the heavy hauling for part of the year. The best pine near the rivers got cut first, and as it thinned out, the lumbermen had to reach farther and farther back from the water for the timber, into country where the rivers could not help them. They needed a way to move logs over dry ground, in any season, and they needed it badly. And this is where Silas Overpack's tall wheels come back into the story, because what that farmer had stumbled onto And what Overpack understood was the answer. Overpack took the idea of those oversized wagon wheels and perfected it into one of the most distinctive machines in American history. He built wheels about 10 feet tall, taller than a man could reach, and he always painted them red. A log, or several logs chained together, was slung underneath the axle between the two great wheels, so that the front end of the load was lifted clear up off the ground, while the back end dragged. Because the wheels were so enormous, they rolled over stumps, brush, mud, and rough ground that would have stopped any ordinary cart dead, and they did not sink into the soft earth of the spring thaw the way smaller wheels did. A team of horses could now skid heavy logs out of the woods over bare ground, in summer, in any season at all. The big wheels, as everyone called them, broke the calendar. Logging no longer had to wait for the ice. Overpack ended up building 3 different sizes of his wheels in his Manistee factory, and he showed them off at the Great World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, where they won an award. If you have ever seen a photograph of Michigan logging, the odds are good you have seen a pair of Overpack's enormous red wheels carrying a single log that looks far too big to move. Loading those wheels was a craft in itself. The teamsters would roll the great wheels over a log, lower a chain and a tongue, and lever the front end of the log up off the ground so it hung beneath the towering axle, the rear of the log dragging behind. Then a team of horses pulled the whole rig out of the woods, the huge red wheels turning slow and steady over ground that would have swallowed an ordinary cart. A good teamster and a strong team could move a load that looks impossible in the old photographs, a single pine log bigger around than the horses pulling it. Overpack's wheels spread far beyond Michigan, out to the forests of the West and even overseas, and other makers copied the idea. But the design was his, born in a Manistee blacksmith shop out of one farmer's odd request, and it stands as one of the quietly brilliant pieces of American working machinery ever built. A lot of the skill behind all of this did not start in Michigan at all. It came west with the men. As the pine of Maine and the Northeast was cut out, the experienced woodsmen and river drivers of New England drifted toward the new forests, carrying their tools, their methods, and their hard-won knowledge of the drive with them. The peavey, the bateau, the boom, the whole craft of moving logs by water, all of it had been learned on the rivers of Maine, and was simply carried to the Saginaw and the Muskegon and put to work on a larger scale. So when you watch the Michigan story, you are watching the Maine story moved west and multiplied, the same craft and often the very same families of rivermen, chasing the pine across the top of the country as each forest in turn was emptied. Then I tell you what happened next, but first, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one, unless enough people click. One click. Come back. The big wheels were one half of the revolution that freed Michigan logging from the rivers. The other half ran on steel rails, and it came from a young lumberman named Winfield Scott Garish. In 1876, Garish visited the Great Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, the World's Fair that marked 100 years of the country. And there he saw a small, light steam locomotive made by a company called Porter. Most men at that fair looked at that little engine and saw a curiosity. Garish looked at it and saw the future of the pine woods. The next winter, in January of 1877, he built a 7-mile logging railroad running from a place called Lake George out to the Muskegon River in Clare County, Michigan. It is remembered as the first commercially successful logging railroad in the country, and very possibly the world. Now, a lumberman did not have to wait for a river or for the ice at all. He could lay light rails straight into the heart of the timber, run a little engine in, load it with logs, and haul them out in any weather. Within a few years, logging railroads were spreading through the Michigan woods like veins, and the last limits on where and when a man could cut were falling away one by one. The men called those little lines the lumber pikes. Light rails were laid quickly and cheaply right up to the cutting, used hard for a season or two, then torn up and moved on when the timber was gone. The railroad did to distance what the big wheels had done to the seasons. Between the two of them, there was now almost no stand of pine in the whole state too far back or too dry or too far from water to reach. With the rivers and the seasons no longer holding them back, the lumber towns boomed beyond anything the country had seen. The cities of the Saginaw Valley, Saginaw and Bay City, and Muskegon on the western shore became some of the richest places in America for one brief and dazzling moment. Fortunes came so fast that the lumber barons built enormous ornate mansions along the river streets, and a few of those mansions still stand today as the strangest monuments to a forest that no longer exists. To grasp the sheer volume of it, think about what reached the mills. At the booms on Muskegon Lake and along the Saginaw, logs arrived not in the dozens or the hundreds, but in the millions, each one stamped on the end with its owner's registered mark, all of them mixed together in the water and waiting to be sorted. Crews worked those booms day after day, reading the marks and herding the logs to the right mill, the same patient sorting work the main boom men did, only on a scale that is hard to even picture. In the biggest years, the logs came down faster than the mills could cut them, and the lakes and river mouths filled with acres of floating timber. The screaming of dozens of saws ran around the clock through the whole open season, and the smell of fresh pine hung over those towns like weather. And here is the thing about all of this ingenuity, the wheels and the rails and the iced roads. It did not slow the cutting down. It sped the cutting up. Every clever machine that made it easier to reach the pine and move the pine simply meant the pine came down faster. The numbers from the start of this video were not the beginning of the boom. They were very nearly the end of it, the last enormous harvest of a forest that was already running out. Think again about what those numbers mean. More than 1 billion feet of pine off the Saginaw in a single year, 47 sawmills ringing Muskegon Lake, and 16 more on White Lake to the north, their saws screaming day and night. Muskegon alone shipping out enough lumber in one season to reach halfway around the world. That pine built Chicago after the Great Fire. It built the farm towns of Illinois and Iowa and the plains. It built railroad cars and fences and furniture across half the country. The forest of Michigan did not stay in Michigan. It was scattered across the whole middle of America in the shape of houses and barns and boardwalks, and the men who put it there were the shanty boys, working in the snow for a winter's wage. It is easy to forget the men in the mills when we picture the loggers out in the woods, but the clearing of Michigan ran on their labor too. Inside the great sawmills, the work was loud, fast, and savage on the body. Men fed logs into screaming circular and bandsaws, hauled wet green lumber, and stacked it to dry in yards that ran for acres along the water. Sawmill work tore off fingers and hands and worse, and the pace never let up while the logs kept coming down the river. Thousands of these mill hands, many of them immigrants who had crossed an ocean for the work, turned the floating logs into the finished boards that actually built the country. They are as absent from the story as the shanty boys, and they were every bit as necessary. And here's where I run into the same wall I always do with these stories. We have the names of the barons. We have Overpack's name on his wheels and Garish's name on his railroad and Hackley's name carved over a library door. But the man who actually swung the axe that dropped a 300-year-old pine, the driver who rode the jam, the teamster who walked all day beside the red wheels, the mill hand who lost 2 fingers to the saw, the records kept almost none of them. A logging company payroll might list a man only by a last name and a daily rate, and when the season ended, he walked out of the woods and out of history. The forest came down on the backs of those men, tens of thousands of them, and they are very nearly invisible now. That is the thing I most want to fix, even a little, by telling the story this way. One quick note. I turned the full story of the clearing of the Michigan pine into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. I want to slow down and be honest about the men in the camps because it would be easy to make this sound romantic, and it was not romantic. It was some of the hardest labor in the country. A shanty boy was out in the woods from before dawn, working in deep snow and brutal cold, swinging an axe or pulling a saw, all day, every day, all winter. He lived in a crowded bunkhouse full of wet wool and wood smoke. He ate enormous meals because he burned enormous energy, and the cook was, just as on the river drives, one of the most important men in the whole camp. He faced falling trees, rolling logs, runaway sleds, frostbite, and in the spring, the cold-killing water of the drive. A man named John Fitzmaurice, who worked as a hospital agent in the camps, wrote a first-hand account in the 1880s, simply called The Shanty Boy, and it lays out the whole hard world of it. The felling, the food, the camp life, the river work, all of it. He is one of the few who bothered to write it down. For most of these men, we have no diary, no letters, no portrait. Only the knowledge that they were there and that the forest could not have come down without them. And then, almost as fast as it had begun, it was over. This is the part that still stuns me when I sit with it. A forest that had taken many thousands of years to grow, that everyone swore was endless, was substantially gone in about 2 decades. By the 1890s, the great pine of the Lower Peninsula was mostly cut. The mills that had roared around Muskegon Lake began to fall silent. The lumber companies packed up their crews, their wheels, and their little railroads and moved on, some of them west to the forests of the Pacific Northwest, some of them south. The boom towns that had been the richest places in the state almost overnight found themselves sitting beside lakes with no more logs coming down. The pine was not inexhaustible after all. It had just looked that way for a little while, to men who could not imagine the bottom of something so vast. What the cutting left behind was a country that is hard to picture now, mile after mile of stumps. The great white pines had been sawn off a few feet above the ground, and what remained was a vast field of pine stumps, sometimes with the dry tops and branches, the slash left scattered between them. That cut-over land, as it was called, was a problem all its own. In dry years, the slash caught fire, and some of the worst forest fires in American history swept across the Michigan cutover, killing people and wiping out whole towns. And for the settlers who came afterward and bought that logged-off land cheap, hoping to farm it, the stumps were the enemy. A field full of giant white pine stumps cannot be plowed. So began another whole era of hard labor that almost never gets told. The work of clearing the stumps, pulling them with horses and chains and stump-pulling machines, blasting the biggest ones apart, burning them, levering them out one by one to turn a logged-off forest into a farm. In some Michigan counties, it cost around $25 an acre just to clear the stumps off the land, a real fortune to a poor settler, and that was after somebody else had already taken all the valuable timber. The men who cleared the stumps inherited the hardest part of the job and the smallest share of the reward. And there was a darker side to the cutover than the stumps. The loggers had left behind enormous quantities of slash, the dried tops and branches and waste of the cut, and in dry years, that slash became a tinderbox. Some of the deadliest fires in American history swept across the logged-off lands of the upper Midwest in these decades, racing through the cutover and the slash, killing people by the hundreds and burning whole towns to the ground in a single afternoon. The same forests that had built distant cities left behind, for a time, a burned and stump-covered country that could be as dangerous as it was poor. Clearing it, farming it, and simply surviving on it became a second great labor, and it fell on people who had never seen a dollar of the fortunes the pine had made. So, what became of our 2 men? Silas Overpack, the blacksmith who gave the woods its red wheels, lived a long life and died in Manistee in 1927, at 85 years old. Having watched the industry, his wheels had served rise and then nearly vanish from his own state. His wheels outlived the Michigan pine. You can still see pairs of them standing in museums around the state, and a giant set became a landmark, a reminder of an invention so simple and so right that it spread far beyond Michigan. And Charles Hackley, the man who turned the pine into $18 million, did something with that fortune that I think is worth ending on. He gave a great deal of it back. Hackley looked at the wealth he had pulled out of the Muskegon woods and decided, in his own words, that a rich man owes his fortune to the public. He gave Muskegon a public library, a hospital, a school, a park, an art museum, a home for the aged, building after building, roughly a third of his entire fortune handed back to the town that the pine had built. The forest that made him was gone, but the gifts he made from it are still standing and still in use today. That is the strange double truth of this whole story, and it is why I wanted to tell it the way I have. The clearing of the Michigan North Woods was, in one sense, a loss almost beyond measuring, a unique and ancient forest cut down in 20 years and never replaced in the same form. And it was, in another sense, one of the most staggering feats of organized hand labor the country ever performed. A forest moved board by board into the homes of millions of people across half a continent. The pine that warmed and sheltered the Midwest came out of Michigan on the backs of the shanty boys and on Silas Overpack's red wheels, and most of the men who did it are as gone as the trees. There is one more turn to this story, and it is a hopeful one. The forest did not stay gone forever. In the early 1900s, after the worst of the fires and the failures of trying to farm the cutover, the state and the nation began to buy back and replant great stretches of that ruined land. In the 1930s, the young men of the Civilian Conservation Corps planted millions of trees across the old Michigan cutover, and much of what was stripped bare a century ago is forest again today. In the national and state forests that now cover the northern part of the state, it is not the same forest. The 200-year-old white pines are not coming back in our lifetimes or our grandchildren's. But the land was given a second chance, paid for by a later generation that had finally learned the hard lesson the word inexhaustible had to teach. Here is the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We tend to name the lumber barons when we tell this story, the Hackleys and the men like him, because they left their names carved over the doors of libraries and hospitals, and they earned that, some of them, by giving the money back. But the forest did not come down because of the men in the counting houses. It came down because of the shanty boys in the snow, the men on the crosscut saws, the drivers on the spring rivers, the teamsters walking beside Overpack's wheels, and later the settlers heaving the stumps out of the ground by hand. They cleared the greatest pine forest in America in a single lifetime, and almost none of them got their names on anything at all. I think the libraries should have their names on them too. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.